What if I told you that one of America's most prolific serial killers was walking around for decades, while dozens of his victims were being forgotten? He wasn't caught after one dramatic manhunt. He wasn't exposed by a brilliant detective. And he didn't confess because he suddenly felt guilty. Instead, years after his crimes began, Samuel Little started telling investigators exactly what he had done. And what he told them was so enormous that the FBI eventually called him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. This is the disturbing story of Samuel Little. Samuel Little was born in 1940 and spent much of his life moving from place to place. He had a long history of arrests and encounters with the criminal justice system. But despite that history, investigators didn't immediately connect him to a nationwide series of murders. For years, cases remained scattered across different cities and states, different victims, different jurisdictions, and often very little evidence connecting them. That fragmentation would become one of the most important parts of this story. According to Little's own confessions, he killed 93 people between 1970 and 2005, almost all of them women. But here's what makes the case especially disturbing. The FBI said many of the deaths had originally been classified as overdoses, accidents, or deaths where the cause could not be determined. Some victims were never found. And in some cases, investigators didn't even know they were looking at murder. That meant Little could move from city to city while individual cases remained isolated. The victims weren't connected in the databases, but Little was. He was the common thread nobody had identified yet. Then, decades later, everything began to change. In 2012, Little was arrested in Kentucky on a narcotics charge and eventually extradited to California. Los Angeles investigators obtained his DNA, and that DNA connected him to 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles dating back to 1987 and 1989. Suddenly, investigators weren't looking at an ordinary criminal. They were looking at a possible serial killer. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICE-AP, began digging through his history. And the pattern kept getting bigger, much bigger. In 2014, Little was convicted of those 3 California murders and received 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. But investigators weren't finished. In 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland began interviewing Little. And Little started talking. He didn't simply say, "I killed people." He provided investigators with locations, approximate dates, descriptions of victims, vehicles, and other details. He even drew portraits of some of the women he claimed to have killed. The FBI began comparing those stories against old homicide files, missing person cases, unidentified victims, and unsolved deaths across the country. And the number kept climbing. By October 2019, Samuel Little had confessed to 93 murders. The FBI had confirmed 50 of those confessions, with many more still awaiting final confirmation. And federal investigators said they believed Little's confessions were credible. That distinction matters. The number 93 represents his confession total, not 93 convictions. But the confirmed cases were enough for the FBI to identify him as the most prolific serial killer in American history. And suddenly, investigators were reopening cases that had been cold for decades. So how could someone potentially be responsible for so many killings without being identified sooner? One answer was the way the crimes were spread across the country. Little traveled. His victims were often vulnerable women, and many of the cases were investigated separately by different police departments. Before modern information sharing systems became more sophisticated, one department might have no idea that a similar case had happened hundreds of miles away. That's where VICE-AP became critical. The FBI's database allowed investigators to compare violent crimes across jurisdictions and search for patterns that individual departments might never see on their own. The Samuel Little investigation became a powerful example of why connecting information matters. But there's something important to remember about this story. The number 93 can become a statistic. But these weren't statistics. They were people. Women who had families, friends, lives, names, and stories. Some were never identified. Some families waited decades without knowing what happened. That's why investigators continued working on Little's confessions even after he was already serving life sentences. The goal wasn't simply to understand Samuel Little. It was to identify the victims and give their families answers. Samuel Little died in prison on December 30th, 2020. But his case didn't end with his death. Investigators continued examining his confessions and searching for connections to unidentified victims and unsolved killings. And perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire story isn't simply the number of murders he confessed to. It's how many cases remained invisible until someone finally connected the dots. Because sometimes the biggest mystery isn't who committed the crime, it's how many times did the system fail to realize the same person was behind it. If you want more stories about the cases that changed American crime investigations, subscribe to Crime Chronicles. And remember, every victim has a story.